What actually is an air gap? Is it even possible with backup stored on disk or in the cloud? Your backup product says that your backups are air gapped. By what standard can you even judge that statement? The answer to all of these questions goes back to my earliest days as a backup admin back in the early 90s. You know, back when we had an actual air gap. Once you know what a true air gap was like, I think I can explain how to use that as a standard to judge the virtual air gaps we have today. Hi, I'm W. Curtis Preston, aka Mr. Backup. I've been a backup admin, consultant, analyst, and even a backup product evangelist. Backup is kind of my thing, and backup folks are my people. This podcast turns unappreciated backup admins into cyber recovery heroes. This is the Backup Wrap-Up. Welcome to the show, and thanks for joining. Conmigo, como siempre, está mi bueno amigo Prasanna Maliandi. How's it going, Prasanna?
Hola, Curtis. ¿Cómo está?
I've been practicing my Spanish, as you know.
Sí, es muy bien.
So for those that don't know what I said, I just said with me, as always, is my friend Prasanna Maliandi, who's been encouraging me in my language attempt. I'm spending a lot of time on the past tense and also on birthdays and ordering food. And
ordering food is important, you know?
Ordering food. Yeah, the next lesson is about renting a car.
There you go.
Also very important. As you can see, they tend to focus on things that you might do while traveling.
Which is good, right? Because it's important to have those skills.
Yeah, exactly. So I want to jump right into our news section, and I want to thank you. You found this story, and it's from the National Cybersecurity Center. That's center with an R-E in the UK.
That should have given it away. It's either going to be the UK or Canada. So one of the two.
Yeah. Well, it could be Australia.
Yeah.
You know, could be that. But they put out, they have some new principles to make cloud backups more resilient. Why do you think they would have done that?
Because there's a lot of issues going around right now with people storing data in the cloud, but it's still being exposed either due to security issues or just improperly securing it, such that when you get hit by ransomware, they go and trash your backups, and now you have nothing you can restore from. I think it goes back to what we've always talked about, Curtis, which is everyone thinks the cloud is magical, and it's just going to alleviate all their problems.
I actually think that the cloud is like the best place where you can put your backups, and we could. I'd love to have somebody on that thinks that. Well, I'm sticking with that.
It is a good place to
myself.
Yes,
I think it's the best place. You know, with caveats, but it is not magic. It does allow you to do things that simply aren't possible in a data center, which is why I have that opinion. But I'm talking about like cloud DR and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's not magic, and you have to. And I'm really glad to see them sort of acknowledge that and to give specific guidance on the use of cloud for backups.
Yep.
Now, you know, throw out your what's your thing? What are you saying? You're like you don't agree with me that it's the best place for backups.
So I agree as long as you're okay if you need to pull the data back down. For example, in your home, right? I know we've talked about this. You have issues running into your data cap limit, right? At home. Imagine if you had something happened, you need to download all your data from the cloud because that's the only place you have your data. One, how long would it take you? Two, how many times would you end up hitting your data usage limit with your provider? And is that reasonable for keeping your only copy in the cloud? That's why I think there are cases where cloud is perfect for keeping a copy because it is off-site, right? You don't have to worry about it. It's all there. It's really low cost. But I think for important data and other things like that, it might be beneficial to keep something local as well. That was my only point. You said the best place for backup.
After everything you just said, I'm sticking by my statement. I never said don't have another copy.
Yeah.
I'm just saying if I was picking one and only one place,
Okay.
which I don't think you should do, but if I was picking one and only one place, I would much rather have it in the cloud than on a device sitting next to my computer,
Plugged in.
or in a disk drive, right? Plugged in, all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
I would just and I am thinking a lot about home users there.
Yeah.
I really feel this way for home users, and the bigger you get, the more challenging it becomes. But and again, I don't have any issue with having a local copy for quick restores. I just really think, like, again, if I only had one, only having a local copy is a really bad idea.
I agree.
So
with
having
you.
we want a remote copy.
Yeah.
And I think that remote copy should be in the cloud. I do not think it should be disks in a disk array, in your data center. We can talk about, again, I'm pro tape. I like tape. Again, I wouldn't mind it being one of the copies.
Yeah.
I hope you don't need to use it because it's going to take a while to get it back.
Yeah.
But so we're
okay,
on the
I'm
same
good.
page.
Yeah. I'm good now.
Okay. All right.
Just want to make sure
So
that anyone is listening does not think that Mr. Backup is not. Yeah, is just saying just go to the cloud for everything.
Yeah, I'm not against local copies. I'm against that as your only option.
Yep.
And okay. So, and of all the options, I still prefer the remote.
Yep.
Again, I still think it's the best option. All of the options have downsides.
Yep.
Right? But the downside to the cloud, if done right, which is what this article is about, is that at least it wouldn't get deleted on you.
Yeah.
Right. But like the local one, it could also be done poorly, which is what this article is about. So this is an interesting. So let's just review real quick because it's kind of we're going to come back to that. They have 5 principles for ransomware resilient cloud backups. The first principle is it should be resilient to destructive actions. Right.
Yep.
I like that. Right. That deletions shouldn't really be deletions. There should be soft delete and things like that. A backup system should be configured so that it's not possible to deny all customer access. So if you lose your internet service, right?
We'll come back to that.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. But basically, when your infrastructure is down, it shouldn't rely on your infrastructure to get in that. We have talked about this in that I do think that your authentication and authorization system for your backup system should be separate.
Yep.
Principle 3, the service allows a customer to restore from a backup version, even if later versions become corrupted. This should be, this is what backups are. You should always go back to previous versions. But I think, again, this is talking about bad design. In previous episodes, we've talked about the difference between replication. And one of the problems with replication is that the backup becomes corrupted. I think what they're saying here is, it's nice to have a copy in the cloud, but if that copy gets corrupted, hopefully you have other versions of that. For robust key management for data at rest, yes, I'm with that. Encryption. The 3 rules of cloud backups. And then also alerts triggered if significant changes are made. I like that a lot.
Yeah. I think
we're going to come back to this.
Yeah.
What? Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was reading it. I was like, that's a lot of what we talk about, but also some bits that we don't always talk about on the podcast. I know maybe when we had Snorkel 42, we might have touched on some of these, but it was a good list. And the other thing I liked about this article is they also split it out into sort of how do you deal with ransomware? Like, how do you build your infrastructure? And then also, a lot of times we struggle because sometimes it's, hey, for enterprises, you have all the budget, you have all the tools, you have all the resources, like people and expertise, but smaller businesses, you don't. And so as part of this set of articles, they also published one for like SMBs and how to protect your environment.
Right. Yeah. And speaking of which, they said that this article, it specifically said, we're not going to tell you how to back up, right? They're just saying there are a bunch of different ways to get a copy in the cloud. They're just saying if you're going to have a copy in the cloud, you need to make sure that it is protected, it's resilient against ransomware attacks. Because, as we have often mentioned, your backups are just as big a target, if not a bigger target, than your primary copy. In fact, I mentioned it on a blog I wrote just the other day, was that Veeam survey that, I call it the Veeam survey, but they actually, and I don't think we explained enough when we did the episode on it, that it was a double blind survey of like 1,000 companies, I think. And they said that, and they weren't, I think I may have assumed that it was Veeam customers. It wasn't Veeam customers. That it was something like, that backups were targeted in like 85% of the attacks. So you've got to do this. And that is, we're going to make a quick switch. We're going to call that the news section. And that's the news. And then we're going to just move right into what I wanted to talk about. We were looking for news articles, and you found this article, and it's absolutely perfect for what I wanted to talk about on this episode. And we've talked about this before, but I want to talk about it in a different way now, and that is this concept of air gap. So I wanted to take people, especially people like you, Prasanna,
back in the day,
that never touched the tape. You never fired a tape in anger. To back when we had an actual air gap. The term has a very specific definition, a history, a connotation, and it comes from back in the day. So again, for those of you that are in IT and you're, maybe you've grown up in this world of disk only backups. That is a lot of you. And so I wanted to just give you a lesson of what it was like to do backups back in the mid 90s.
Well,
what were you doing in the mid 90s, Prasanna?
I might have been in elementary school.
Elementary school.
No, probably middle school.
That's great.
Yeah,
that's great. Well, it's okay. I'm actually feeling young today because I was talking to our friend of the pod, Stuart, and he was telling me how he joined the Air Force, like he enlisted in the Air Force the day before his draft number was called. And so, which means he is a lot older than me.
You just need to hang around with people who are older than you all the time, and that way you always feel young. That's why I hang out with you, Curtis.
Feel young. Yeah, exactly. So, nice. I see what you did there. Let me go back to the time. And what we had at our sort of technological height in that data center was we had a bunch of Spectralogic tape libraries. They were there. I think they started calling them tree frogs. We didn't call them that, but basically they were like, I don't know how many U is that, like 3U high, something like that. And inside was a carousel, and there were, I think, 4 DDS tape drives in that carousel. And then the robot rotated like in the middle. It didn't have to move. It just rotated, and it would take a tape from a slot on that carousel and then slightly rotate and then put that tape in the tape drive. And then there was a door on the front that was basically the ejection port, right? Similar, fancier, more expensive units, like from Storage Tech, you had a robot that was in the middle that would turn around and it would grab the tapes and put them in the tape drive. But then you actually had you had a cartridge. I don't know what we called that, but basically there was this unit that sat in the door that the robot could actually put like 10 tapes in that in that removable carrier. I don't remember what we called it. And we'd take it out, and there would be like 10 tapes in that, and then you could move that around as a unit. But basically, the principle was the same: that you had a robot that moved the tapes around, and then you had the ability to eject specific tapes. And the way we did it, again, proper backup design, you always have 2 copies. So we would make a backup copy to tapes that were in that tape library, and then we would copy those tapes or those backups to other tapes, which then at the end of the night, we would then spit those tapes out into that ejection port. And then we would have, if I could, I don't remember how many tapes it was, but I know that it fit in like a storage bin that was like 6 inch. What's that?
Like, I was going to say like a cardboard box.
No, it was a plastic. It was like one of those plastic things
totes,
with the lids the totes that the lid is like part of the unit, right? So you'd open it up, you'd put the tapes in. I don't even think we, you would put the tapes inside. There was a holder that each tape was held, so that kept the tape itself physically secure. And then you put those tapes inside a this tote, and then you would. We had a barcode scanner, and I don't know. So I'll just stop there because this is it's kind of a long story. So does any of that? Did you learn anything from any of that?
Yeah, you basically had 2 copies, and they were never always in the device itself that was easily accessible. It was kind of stored separately. And then you had 1 copy separated out that you could keep somewhere else if you decided to move it off site or whatever else you wanted to do with it.
Right. So again, the key is, separate these 2 copies as much as you can. So we would put those copies, and every tape had a barcode, and we had a barcode scanner, and we had a database that it was an Informix database. We had a custom built app where I could scan all of the barcodes of all of the tapes that were going into today's tote. And then that would create like a pick list. And that would, well, it's not really a pick list, but it was a list of the tapes that were going in today's tote. And then that list would go in the tote. And then we had a guy from Iron Mountain. Sometimes the guy was a girl, right? Sometimes it wasn't always a man
in the van.
Sometimes it was a woman. Yeah, we use the term man in the van. There was a man in the van that came and picked up our tapes, and they would scan the tapes like as they're picking them up. So we had like an electronic receipt that they had picked up our tapes. And then when they got to the actual physical location, by the way, here's a little piece of trivia. How do you, it's a trick question, really. How do you spot Iron Mountain vans with tapes in them?
The giant logo on the side?
No. See, I told you it was a trick question. If Iron Mountain, if you have vans that have the Iron Mountain logo, that has paper inside. Yeah. The tape, the vans Unmarked. That transported media did not have, they were not branded at all. And then they would go to the Iron Mountain facility, and then there were 2 ways to do it. We did it the more secure way. You could put a barcode on the tote and just not let them open the tote. Mm-hmm. But what we did was we had them open the tote and then scan each barcode into a shelf that it had a slot, right? And they would scan, like there was a barcode next to the slot, and then there was a barcode on the tape, and they would scan it. So we could say we need tape number, ABC 123, and they had a computer that would tell them exactly where that was in the vault, and they could send us just that tape. Because the other way is if you needed a tape that was in a particular tote, you had to bring back the entire tote. So they would scan in each of these tapes, and then we got we had an electronic connection to. It was very cutting edge, really, for early 90s. But we had an electronic connection to Iron Mountain. We would get notification that tapes had been scanned in, and then we had a system that would basically double check their list of tapes that have been scanned in to our list of tapes that they should have scanned in. And one time out of 1,000, there might be a discrepancy. There would be a missing tape, and it was always found, but it was we were notified immediately that they did not know where one of our tapes were. So again, the principle there is to find out the problem before you need the tape.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That's pretty cool, don't you think? Of all that stuff that we did back in the day.
Yes, and I would not want to be the person maintaining that system of just data transfer back and forth and trying to keep these things in sync.
Yeah. And then, of course, they had the reverse process when they had to scan the tapes out of their vault into a tote, and then we would scan them back into our system, right? And then the barcodes didn't change. The barcode was part of the actual tape, and then it would just go into essentially back into a drawer,
and reused or whatever else,
and then reused, right? And the key, and then the other part, and I think I've talked to you about this before, is we then did pen testing against our own vault.
Oh yeah,
right. So that's penetration testing. So we did physical penetration testing. We would send people that weren't authorized to be in the vault to go over to the vault to see if they could get in. They always had some crazy story.
Yeah.
And we had rules. It was like you just can't ever let someone who isn't on the list into the vault, right? And we would concoct stories to
why they need to be in there.
Of why we need to be there. So we would either send a person who wasn't authorized to be there, or we would send somebody that they knew, like me, and I'm over there with this massive, inconvenient, pick list, and it's going to take hours. And it's one tape, out of, and the idea was what I'm trying to get them to do is to leave me alone in the vault with other people's media. That never happened. I'm glad to tell you that never happened. And we didn't ever, as I recall, none of our pen tests ever actually worked. Right. But we always did it on a semi-regular basis. Yeah. But just trying to think if there's any element of that, and so when we needed a tape, we sent an electronic request. I think we could probably call. We could probably call and we could say, "Hey, we need tape. We need tape ABC 123," and they would then bring that tape back. I will say that this process was not perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I think our process was as good as it could have been. We knew when our tapes got scanned in. We knew when our tapes got scanned out. We knew when they were in transit. We knew. We just basically knew, and there were glitches where sometimes there would be a tape that would be in limbo, and it always got found, right? Not everybody had that level of
integration.
What's that?
Integration, sophistication.
Yeah, sophistication, I think, would be a great word, because sometimes, especially people that went by the tote method, right? They just put a bunch of tapes in the tote. They don't really have any tracking for individual tapes. I remember at a consulting company that I used to work at, that they got a box of tapes from a leading media management storage company, and it wasn't their tapes.
Oh,
no. And then they called their rep for this company, and the rep typed and said, looked up the barcodes of the tapes and whatnot. And the rep said, I don't know who those tapes are. You can go ahead and keep them and use them.
What? Wow.
Yeah. So like I said, it wasn't perfect, So you could misconfigure things back then, just like you misconfigure things now.
Yeah.
But the key takeaway here is that when the feces hits the rotary oscillator, the 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 tapes, the backups, were in a physically separate location using a completely different authentication and authorization system, right? You couldn't hack them to save your life. There was no way, there was literally no process to like send an electronic request to have those tapes, to anything to be done with those tapes. It was always a human
Could
in the way.
could they not? Sorry, could a mischievous hacker
Mm-hmm.
fake up an electronic request to request all your tapes back?
They could, but those requests were always verified in person.
Ah, okay.
They were very, very rare. Anything outside of the tapes coming back at their normal expiration date, because
Mhm.
that's what I was describing earlier
Yeah.
was, we had like a 6 week retention. At 6 weeks, a box would come back and we would send them a new box. So
Yeah.
we had 6 weeks worth of tapes over there. Anything outside of that was really, really rare
It's an exception
and
case, and
had all
yeah.
kinds of controls put around it to make sure that a single rogue employee can't do what again, you had what we call it like four eyes
Mm.
um, authentication.
Yeah.
You had to have two people do it and things like that. But the key here, it's just that we talk about this phrase air gap just gets thrown around so much. And so I thought it would be interesting to just say that is the standard by which I am measuring something that is calling itself an air gap.
Which I think totally makes sense. Now, I have a question though. For
Yeah.
So imagine that you weren't shipping the tapes off to Iron Mountain,
Mm-hmm.
right? You had your tape library. It
Mm-hmm.
was creating tapes. It would pull the tape out, put it in a separate spot. Do you consider that air
Mm-hmm.
gapped? Or based on your
No,
definition
because
of
it's
what
in
it
the same place as the primary.
Gotcha.
If it's just pulled out, if it's just like if let's say, because I've seen people do this, they've got two robots.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember like having some people would have a tape library in this building and a tape library in this building, and they had a fiber
Connectivity.
channel SAN.
Yeah.
And so they had enough bandwidth that they could copy from this tape library to that tape library. And they thought of that as an air gap. And I'm like, I can sit here on my keyboard and delete every one of those tapes over in that tape library. That's not an air gap. Okay.
Yeah. So the reason I bring this up is I think going back to what you're saying, a lot of people think air gap just means no physical connectivity. It's offline. It's not
Mm-hmm.
accessible. Right.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is that's part of the definition, but really the other part is you have the controls in place. You have a separate sort of communications channel and to be able to pull the data back and other things like that.
Right. Yeah. So, you and I were joking about Little Indian and Big Indian, which is spelled with an E, by the way, for those that don't know what that is. This is like that. It was like a little air gap and a big air gap.
Yeah.
Right? So, like a true air gap means that it's somewhere else,
Yeah.
right? Not just a 6-inch gap of air sitting in a drawer.
Yeah.
Again, I would have no problem with having tapes sitting there in a drawer. Like if you don't have a big enough tape library and you've got tapes that's your on-prem copy, but your other copy needs to be in another location.
I'm just wondering though, like industry definition. I know this is Curtis's definition of what an air gap is to solve the problems that existed back in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Industry terms though today, do you think that the industry follows that same terminology or that same thought when they think about an air gap? Because I would say that most people, at least like when I heard the term air gap, right, it was really around that there's no direct access connectivity to the data. So if
Mm-hmm.
you are, so I've seen some vendors who would say, look, I don't have any, like one thing is like a SCIF, right? A secure
Right.
compute
Right.
infrastructure framework, whatever it is, right? It's basically a secure
Yeah.
environment where there's no connectivity to outside, right? And they call
Yeah.
that an air gap.
In terms of, yeah, in terms of, industry definition, there's basically two groups of people in the industry. There's vendors, and then there's people like me, right? No one like me would define an air gap the way that you're talking about,
Okay.
right? I mean, maybe, you know, we could talk about an air gapped system that is sitting there in the data center that isn't physically connected to anything.
But then what's the point of it?
I knew an air gap system. Well, it wasn't actually air gapped. It was just, again, electronically air gapped. When I did work for the large internet retail company, their payment processing system was air gapped in a lot of ways, right? But it's still, in order to work, it
Needs
wasn't
connectivity.
actually air gapped.
Yeah.
It was just right. But I
Which
couldn't talk to it in any other way.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's important because as our listeners are probably trying to read vendor brochures and other things and trying to understand like what is air gap versus what's not, because a lot of vendors, like you said, throw out the term, oh, we're air gapped. Right. So I think
Right.
it's important to
So
understand why you need air gapping, right? And what problems it is solving for. So then you can evaluate, is it truly an air gap or not? And I think you gave a good example earlier on in this
yeah,
episode about, hey, here's what air gap solved for me.
yeah. So I think that a properly designed backup and DR system, one of the copies needs to be in another physical location, and it needs to be air gapped and separated from the primary in as many ways as possible. I'm not asking anybody, and I know some people still make tape copies, and I have no problem with that, but I'm not asking large companies to start going out and buying big tape libraries and copying it. Although I'm sure our friends at IBM and Spectralogic and all these companies and Fujifilm would be very, very happy for you to do that. I'm just saying that we take that as a standard, this physically separate place where I have to go through a different process. And again, the principles to take away from that are that normal tape rotation was fine. That just happened.
Normal
That
retention,
sort of,
right?
yeah, normal, which basically
Yeah.
in modern day term would be normal retention. Backups being deleted automatically by your backup system after your retention period expires should just happen. Where the alarms should go off and the protection goes up is when you're transferring those backups back or deleting those backups prior to any other normal time frame. And we have to protect against that in as many ways as possible and as many ways as you can that were like what we used to do,
Yeah.
right? And again, you look at I thought it'd be great to revisit the news here from the UK. And again, this is from the National Cyber Security Center. By the way, cyber spelled with an EER, but center is with an RE. I don't know what's that about. Anyway, so you want to tackle the first principle?
Yeah. So the first principle is backup should be resilient to destructive actions, which I think is what you just said, right? So you want to
Yeah.
make sure that anytime you are trying to delete the backup after it's been created before the retention policy goes off, right? You want to make sure that that's not allowed. And then the other thing that they also mention is offering a soft delete mechanism where
Yep.
it goes away. The system thinks it goes away, but it still exists. And this allows you to recover in case you actually need it.
Right.
And then if you are doing any deletion or alteration requests, right, you delay the implementation of it. So if someone says, hey, I want to delete everything older than 30 days, you don't allow that to happen for, say, 2 weeks, as
Right.
well as alerting when that happens.
The other thing that's part of that is the forbidding destructive requests, right, from customer accounts. What I like here is so here's a phrase I'm reading from this: all exceptional destructive requests, again, going back to what I said before, things out of the norm, all exceptional destructive requests must be authorized out of band using a pre-agreed upon mechanism between the customer and the backup service. So it's okay to create a backup system that allows for this, but it needs to not just be somebody pointing and clicking, right? Yeah. Something issuing an API call and then the data just gets deleted. It needs to be a conversation between two people that know each other. And you can put all of the protections, again, just like the protections that I talked about back then. You can say, hey, I have this security phrase. You can have multiple security phrases. And I need to give you the name of my dog that's named after a Indian sweet treat.
Or you could say Curtis is guapo.
Curtis guapo, yeah. I remember my when we had a security company for the house here. Mm-hmm. I remember that our passcode was Lumpia. That was our security passphrase. Like if you had a false alarm, this was everything's fine, and they're like, "What is your passcode?" And you're like, "Lumpia," and they're like, "Okay." And yeah, there could also be a distress code, which our passcode is, I don't know, some other thing. But yeah, it's out of band. And again, because of AI, because of the ability to mimic speech, and you need to have multiple. You need to basically do things that aren't stored digitally anywhere, that can't be stolen and then used against you.
Yeah.
So you need a passcode, right?
Don't leave the passcode in your email box.
Don't exactly, right? Well, don't ever put it in your email box, right?
Here's a question:
have a conversation with a real person. Yeah.
So I know we've talked about password managers in the past.
Mm-hmm.
Would you put that passphrase in your password manager?
I might.
I would say no.
Yeah, we could have a separate conversation about that, but you shouldn't.
Yeah.
It's just a question of, it's the whole, like, this is like that episode that we had of, like, how do you do things when you've lost everything?
Yeah.
Right. You need a fail-safe place. Right. All right. We could talk about that all day.
Yeah.
So the next thing is, a backup system shouldn't be configured so that it's possible to deny all customer access. And the way I'm interpreting this is making sure that if Active Directory in your site goes down, you don't lose access to your backup system because it's using Active Directory.
Yeah. Or if the customer is able to compromise your policies, right? You want to make sure it's not all tied to a single account.
Exactly. And we've talked about this quite a bit.
Yeah.
Please don't use Active Directory, as your password management system for critical infrastructure like this. We had, by the way, you may recall when we had that person that had a DR scenario, right? Mm-hmm. And they were in an island in the
Caribbean.
Remember, we didn't say the island. It was the island in the Caribbean that they went there after a hurricane. And one of the problems they had was that their backup systems relied on Active Directory that was where? In the mainland.
Yep, which they had no connectivity to.
So don't do that, right? Yeah. That's principle 2.
Yeah.
You want to talk about principle 3?
So principle 3 is making sure that you could restore from a backup version, even if other versions are corrupted. And this is, like we've talked about, right? You get hit with ransomware, it's going to start corrupting data, right? And you might not notice it for 20 days. And so you want to make sure that you can go back and restore from a version, right? Even though the newer versions are old. So making sure that you have a way to keep those backup versions. I know in a previous episode, we talked about replication and why replication is not great for backups. Right. So making sure that you have that, making sure there's a mechanism to test. I know That's been one of the things that we always talk about is verify your backups, because a non-verified backup is useless.
This is one that, to me, as a backup person, I'm saying, well, yeah, duh, but but not everybody has versions in their backup.
Yeah.
Your backup has to have versions, right? It can't be just a replicated copy of the most recent transactions. It's got to have the ability to go back in time.
Yep.
And this is more true now than ever before.
Yep.
You've got to be able to go, because they could corrupt both your primary and your backup copy.
Yep. And so just make sure you have that. And then also make sure you have a retention period, right? Or say that you are going to store a fixed number of backups based on time rather than number of backups, right? So instead of saying
just number of versions, yeah.
And just be flexible in having different storage policies. Not everything needs to be kept for the same amount of time, right? And just say, okay, I don't need all my copies to be stored for 6 years or 6 months even. Maybe I only need dailies for a month, and then after that I can do weeklies. So allow these flexible policies, because that'll make it more flexible and allow you to keep data for longer periods of time as well.
Exactly. The next principle is robust key management for data at rest protection is in use. So yeah, if it's backups, it needs to be encrypted, and you need a robust key management system that allows you to do things like rotate keys, delete keys. Also, they talk about offering an out-of-band key backup option, right? There are companies that will actually do key escrow for you.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, again, that you need a doomsday copy of that. You need the way to basically bring in a key management system. Again, think about everything going wrong. And again, when your primary goes down, you don't want your cloud backup system, for example, to rely on the key management system in your data center.
Yep. That would be bad.
Yeah, that would be bad.
So
that's a relatively easy one. Go ahead.
So going back to a previous story you told about that company you worked for that ended up getting the wrong tote of tapes.
Yeah.
Did they ever check the tapes to see if the data was encrypted?
I didn't get to, probably not back in that time frame.
Okay.
Right.
So yeah. So even if you are using tapes, make sure you encrypt your data. It shouldn't just be for the cloud copies.
And I will say encryption done properly doesn't slow down your backups.
Yeah.
So
the last one.
So by the way, I will say this: dedupe, then encrypt. Don't encrypt, then dedupe. Because dedupe works by looking for patterns. Encryption works by getting rid of them.
Yes.
So you got to do that in the right order.
Yeah.
All right. Final principle here
is alerts, right? This is super important that whenever significant changes are made, that you have some alerting mechanism so you understand what's going on. Significant could be things like someone went and added a new user, or they're trying to change the retention policy. You want to make sure that you can catch these as early as you can to make sure that there's nothing funky going on in your environment.
The key here is, just when something out of band or out of the norm is happening, especially when it's a high risk thing like deleting backups or restores.
Yeah.
I don't know how you've seen it, but nobody restores anything, right? I mean, it's like we make all these backups and they very, very rarely restore data. And so when a restore kicks off, that should be a high risk alert that is going off saying,
"Danger, Will Robinson! Danger! No, Will Robinson! Danger!"
Hey, there is this restore going on, and you're all like, "Oh yeah, we're doing the restore of the thing. Everything's fine." But if you see this big alert that's going on, there's a big old restore going on, and no one knows who's kicked off the restore, you can do something about it at that point, right? There was, we had a cyber expert on the podcast a couple months ago, and he talked. Remember how he said he loves backup systems?
Yep.
Because he loves to use them to steal data. We're like, oh, that's really depressing.
But I think another one that they call out that I think doesn't get enough focus is people stopping backups.
Yes.
Right. In addition. Right. Because
yeah, agreed. Yeah.
a lot of ransomware actors, they'll stop your backups and you may not realize it for 15 days. And by then, you don't have any good backups left because your old backups have already expired.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up. Because a lot of the reporting that's built in is they tell you when a backup is done. They don't tell you when a backup didn't happen.
Yeah.
So yeah, you want to have reporting kickoff when something like that happens, stopping your backups, because they could stop your backups for, let's say, a week. If they're able to do that, and then they can corrupt your data, that, and your oldest copy is a week ago, you're gonna lose data.
Yeah, you're going to lose data, or you're probably going to be more willing to pay the ransom.
Right. So again, I am not only am I not against cloud copies of data, I really like cloud copies of the data. I want us to be careful with the term air gap. I want to make sure, are you doing all of these things? How are you mimicking? The overarching question is, how am I mimicking what Curtis did with a box of tapes in Iron Mountain back 30 years ago? That is the standard by which your backups should be measured in terms of protecting them, because they were protected without doing it on purpose. We were protecting it both from natural disasters as well as hacks. It's just back then the hacks were very, very uncommon. So, but now the hacks are the primary reason that we're doing restores.
So this might be a controversial question, and we don't have to answer it.
Okay.
Based on everything you've said and what you're looking to solve with air gaps, would you call cloud data protection vendors air gapped?
I think that, again, have they separated their data from your data? So I'll just say this. At best, I'm going to call all of these guys electronically air gapped or virtually air gapped. None of them are actually air gapped. Okay. Because they're all running in a computer that's connected to something.
Yep.
That's the only real air gap. So at best, I'm going to call them virtually air gapped. And so it's a standard by which we measure something. And so my question is, how close to you are that? Yeah. Do you have a separate authentication and authorization system, right? Do you have the ability to delete backups like does the hacker have the ability to delete backups? Do you have all the principles that they talked about here? I think if they're following the principles found in here, I think they could be called virtually air gapped. The problem is not all of them do.
Yeah.
Right. And if you look at the question is, can I electronically, delete a bunch of stuff without
any checks in place? Yeah.
Right. And if that stuff gets deleted, is it really deleted? Can I get it back? What kind of multi-factor authentication system do you have in place? Do you have things like multi-person authentication for big actions? Like, I like the multi-person. Some people call it 4 eyes. I like the multi-person, the multi-system authentication. Again, speaking of standards, it's like the missile key thing, right? It's not possible for one person to turn both missile keys. So you add in all those things, and if you've got all this protection, I think I'd be fine with calling them virtually air gapped. But some of them don't have those systems. Just because they're cloud doesn't mean they're doing all these things. In fact, there's a reason that the UK government came out with these principles, and that's because they're not always followed.
Yeah.
So, well, hopefully that was helpful to some people.
And we'll throw links to the article in the show description.
Yeah, it's a great article. By the way, I think what we should do next is what actually immutable is.
Yeah.
That's another one that we talk about. All right. Well, thanks, Prasanna, for your wisdom as always.
I tried, Curtis, and thank you for the educational lesson on air gap
from back in the day.
Yes.
And always, thanks to our listeners. That's a wrap. The Backup Wrap-Up is written, recorded, and produced by me, W. Curtis Preston. If you need backup or DR consulting, content generation, or expert witness work, check out backupcentral.com. You can also find links for my O'Reilly books on the same website. Remember, this is an independent podcast, and any opinions that you hear are those of the speaker and not necessarily an employer. Thanks for listening.